where we go next with this. How do we actually build a completely new sort of way of thinking about economic systems from an economic perspective? And the surprising point actually is we actually have to start with economies as we know them. Crash course, let me give you 6 years of economics in 6 seconds. Market economies, made of markets, firms are somehow involved in that. Commons is a kind of off in the corner. But the basic relationship is markets do all the information processing of exchange. Governments sit underneath that and do property rights. And then they have sort of monopoly on violence to enforce those property rights. They have institutional legitimacy to do the court systems and so on, yada, yada, yada. That's Douglass North, if any of you are sort of into that sort of thing. But first approximation, that's modern economics right there, is that idea. What's wrong with it? Everyone in this room will be able to spot lots of things. But the main one is externalities. Just all the things that don't get into markets because they don't get into property rights. And so we usually use government again to go through and correct all those mistakes with various sort of taxes and regulations and all of the things to sort of hack market systems, right? So there it is, the modern world. Elinor Ostrom came along and said, that's lovely, Douglas, but you missed a few things, and pointed out that the things that were missed was this whole other universe of basically private order. A group of people come together, they build their own governance systems for the set of governance resources, all right? What I want to suggest when we go forward is the question is what's after that? Like what's the next generation of economies look like in the 21st century or 22nd century? Do we go sort of post-capitalism? Do we push down that direction? Do we go deep commonses? And the answer I want to give is as I hope possibly, or the purpose of this talk is to suggest a new sort of, and I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it third way, which kind of combines these two into a single new type of mechanism, a market plus commons. Right? It doesn't have a name yet. I haven't been able to come up with a name, but I want to make the case for it. And the weird thing it's going to do is we're going to use commonses, not just for holding resources, common pool resources. We're going to use them for building property rights. That's the odd new thing. Why is that weird and odd? Because we usually use governments for doing that. All right, so that's the TLDR. Why is this interesting? So economists all worship at the temple of markets. This is why they worship at the temple of markets. It's because we don't love markets for their allocation consequences. Generally, that's a little bit horrible and unjust, except in finance. But the reason that markets work is they are highly efficient. There's the economics word, efficient. Mechanisms for computing local information into prices. So markets are institutional mechanisms to create prices as information signals. Those information signals gather up local information. That's the Hayek 1945, single most important paper in all of 20th century economics argument. Markets work because they process local information into a single message, a price. All right? All right, commonses. What the sort of Hayek perspective gave us way back in 1945, before computers, was the first insight of an economy doing computation. How does an economy compute? It doesn't have an operating system. It has a market mechanism. What the market mechanism does is it gathers up distributed information from all of the local preferences and local information, computes them into prices. All of the distributed agents respond to those prices, and you get economic coordination. That's an economic computation. Firms help with that process by gathering together specialized resources and building them, forming plans around those to build things. All right, that's 20th century economics in terms of why do markets work at scale, and firms don't work at scale. Firms work locally. All right, commonses, what are they doing? So the relevant question is not why do commonses work? Because Elinor Ostrom answered that question. They work through local governance to create local communities, to govern local resources, and generally they're pretty good at that. How do commonses compute? Right, so the weird thing about the most obvious thing you can say about a commons compared to a market system is market systems have prices and property rights. Commonses have rules for governance, but there's no prices in commons, right? So just, again, this is sort of, I'm stating really obvious things out loud for the purpose of hopefully stating something less obvious that follows from that. But what I want to do is to think about, if we're trying to build new economies for the future, and we want those new economies to be better than the previous economies, then they have to do more compute. The future economies have to be more computationally complex than previous ones. So the question is, where do we get that compute from? We can't really get it from governments because that's not what governments do. They're not compute mechanisms. We can get it from markets. That's what markets are, compute mechanisms, but they're limited by property rights. So they can only compute what they can see. And this is why this is, basically, intellectual property or privatizing anything is basically about making it visible, making a thing visible to a market for compute. Oops, where'd it go? Sorry, I lost it again. All right, so that's the challenge, how to build more compute. All right, so economies compute, markets, that's why we like markets, but markets fail in all sorts of ways, especially ecosystem, ecology, just every externality you can, knowledge, every externality you can possibly think of. That's where they fail. All right, thank you. All right, so I've done some work on this previously, sort of what led me into this. We can put markets and commonses together. And one of the most interesting sort of places that we've found to put markets and commonses together is that in innovation and in the creation of new knowledge. Commonses sit really nicely right at the beginning of innovation because it's basically you have to pull lots of ideas together to see insights and opportunities. Then markets tend to create them, intellectual property, startup firms, venture capital, off they go, innovation trajectory. So we are sort of familiar with commonses and markets working together in this way. But what I want to suggest is that part of the reason we're all in this room together is we are trying to solve this problem. How do we build next generation economies that are fit for purpose, that humans and animals and plants and all of the human biosphere can live comfortably within, without sort of destroying one or the other. And there's a lot of different sort of ways forward. Like one is you just go hypermarket and you just privatize all the animals and privatize all the plants, and you do that, right? And okay, well, the logic behind that idea is to exploit, well, if we've got good property rights, we'll have good information, we'll have good compute, and that should, in theory, work, except it doesn't for relatively obvious reasons. A lot of other economists have sort of tried to build hybrid systems where you sort of combine governments and you sort of just try and make governments smarter and better, which usually means making citizens smarter and better, and you use democracy plus engagement and involvement, and you just try and push a good political democratic system to improve the mess. All of that fundamentally is about this idea that markets do kind of work. It's just that they're not well targeted, and if we can find ways to make them more collectively targeted or to meet sort of broader social goals, then that's an effective mechanism. So that's kind of where we are, is arguing and debating around that sort of space. And I sort of point out that this isn't new. Economists have been arguing about this for a century or so, around sort of how you try and combine these things together. So let me propose next version of this. All right. What we agree on, we're trying to solve big social problems. We're trying to build new economies. For that, we need better markets. Right? That's a non-contentious thing to say. What's challenging is what we mean by better. Right? So does better mean overthrowing capitalism? With that, can we just keep patching it? What I want to suggest is that what we mean by better markets is more compute into them. We need to have more prices need to be richer information sources. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that's basically impossible because they're already at their limits defined on whatever the property rights system is. Okay, switch gears. To solve big social problems, we need better commons. What does better commons mean? The same thing. They need to be able to compute more effectively. What does compute more effectively mean? Better governance. And again, this is Web3 sweet spot, is coming in trying to build that better governance. So far, that's where we are right now, is a number of different paths all being pursued simultaneously, all trying to do more or less the same thing, build better economies, solve big social problems by trying to improve the existing mechanisms. Third option, build a new mechanism that combines the properties of both. Commons, markets, market commons, whatever. Special prize for anyone who can come up with a good name for this. But what that is this. I sort of mentally think of it as an object-oriented economy. It's a way of spinning up sort of hundreds and millions of economies, not just nation-state-sized ones. So pop-up economy, whenever we need something, we're not building a firm or a market, we're building entire economies. But the novelty of this insight is about what markets and what commons are doing. So we want to think of markets doing basically the information processing associated with property rights, mostly about sort of enabling what financial markets are doing, exit liquidity. That exists. The new idea is commons is providing contributions to sharpen up property rights. And by sharpening up property rights, what we mean are sharpening up rights around contributions, rights around value, rights around this is what the community values and believes in, and this is where we think the line should go around this thing. And that's sort of something that you're starting to see in things like MetaGov. You're starting to see, there's lots of sort of experiments that are coming out of Web3 that are doing this. And they're small and they're quirky. But my conjecture here is that actually is the secret. That is the thing that we could potentially expand all the way out, connect it with markets, and try and build these things together. All right, what does that sort of look like? In context, 19th century, classical economics, labor theory of value, that was wrong for interesting reasons. Basically, it was purely objective, lacked market mechanisms. Exchange theory of value, market is also weird and wrong for mostly because of what it leaves out. It doesn't include externalities. Contribution theory of value is basically a hybrid subject-object combination of this theory of value. And what it's basically doing is getting richer information into prices to enable that to work. So think of it as like the slow food, slow price movement. Food is information, prices are information. We get better value by slowing things down to experience richer information. It's the same thing with what we're trying to do here. So in the interest of time, we've written about this on that site, if you're interested in this. But I'll jump straight to sort of a conclusion here. I think this is where we go next, right? This is the next generation economies need to be next generation computers. Those next generation computers will benefit from combining the properties of both of the main decentralized mechanisms we have. Markets are decentralized, commons are decentralized, but they have very, very different properties. You combine them together to create a new type of mechanism and theory of value. The implication there is, I think, that's the direction I think that we should be thinking about for how do we build next generation economies. And we have a lot of these mechanisms in place. This enables us to sort of try and combine these two ideas together. Again, very experimental still, but the relevant point is that we couldn't have possibly done this at any previous point in history. This idea, all of the components of this have been around for decades, but it's really only in the past handful of few years that we've actually had the compute components on the common side that are capable enough and scalable enough to be able to build these new types of mechanisms. So I wanted to suggest that as That's where I think sort of next generation economics is going, is this new type of these new types of mechanisms.